Welcome to Prepared for Parenthood, the podcast for hopeful, expectant, and new parents with little ones up to age 5. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Duger, a psychotherapist, author, educator, parent coach, and married mother of 2. On this show, we'll discuss everything from the most up-to-date practicals of best supporting your young children, to thriving in relationship as a family, to more surprising topics around the psychology and development of babies from conception through age 5. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm thrilled to have you here today. Welcome back to Prepared for Parenthood. I'm thrilled today to have Heather Elkins with us. She's an international board-certified lactation consultant and a specialist in infant feeding, and is the founder of Root Love Lactation Services. Heather also has a degree in law and practiced healthcare law before establishing her consulting business. She recently concluded working on a 5-year grant initiative aimed at diminishing health disparities and enhancing overall health statewide in Colorado. The project focused on establishing an integrated network of lactation support for parents and families, spanning their workplaces, childcare facilities, medical offices, and local community spaces. Heather serves on the board of Clinic of Family Health and is the vice president at the Northern Colorado Breastfeeding Coalition. She lives in Boulder, Colorado with her husband, 2 children, and their beloved sheepdog, Gertie. So welcome. So happy to have you here, Heather.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this.
Could you share a little bit about how you started out as a lactation consultant, what your journey was into that field?
Absolutely. So I had my son just a little over 11 years ago, and in my mind knew that old adage, quote unquote, breast is best, and wanted to breastfeed him, but had very little prenatal support to do so. And then in the postpartum period, ended up with a 5-day-old in the emergency room because I just couldn't get him to latch at breast. He was lethargic. I called the nurse's line. It was a Sunday and they said, take him to the ER. And so of course, here I am, first-time parent. I'm panicked. We wrap him up. We take him to the ER and they're like, we don't know what to do with him in the ER. Like, why is he here? Give him some formula. Here's like an ounce or 2 of formula. And sure enough, he perked up after that because now I know. And 2020 hindsight, he wasn't eating enough. And I had minimal lactation support in the hospital, which mostly was having a very well-meaning nurse try to shove him onto my breast. And I really just didn't know what I didn't know. And so I went home and I was like, okay, how is this going to work? I think I Googled in my sleep-deprived brain, like lactation support. And I had this really wonderful lactation consultant come out on a Sunday and met with me and just kind of walked me through some basics that were just missing in my knowledge. And had I known, I don't think we would have ever gotten to that crisis point. So I really feel like she came in and saved the day for me. And I ended up having a really successful nursing journey with him and was able to breastfeed him for 2 years until I was pregnant with my second kiddo and had no issues with her. Actually, we went on to nurse for 4 years. We just thought, like, let's do this grand experiment to see how long she might go. And at the end of the day, we both decided we're done nursing. But it was so nice to have a different experience the second time around because I really did know what I was doing and had gotten a lot more training. I had been practicing full-time as a healthcare attorney. I had this real sense that it wasn't what I wanted to be doing outside of the home, 50 plus hours a week. And I just got really curious about lactation and started volunteering with the Boulder County WIC program, got more education, and then decided to do a 50-hour training to become a certified lactation counselor. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to take this bigger leap and become board certified, which was a whole other going back and getting more classes, lactation specific classes and 500 mentored hours, and really sort of jumped feet first. And I love being able to support families. I love being able to just be part of their journey and whatever lactation looks like for them, or just infant feeding in general.
So quite a journey for you coming into that with 2 children and your first, who it sounded like there was a little bit of a struggle with just getting used to nursing. You share some on your website about the importance of prenatal lactation consulting and education. Can you share why that would be important and how many people actually seek out support prenatally?
I think it's just so important. I think there are so many things, right, that go into becoming pregnant with a child and birthing a child and so many different decision points. And then let alone once this child is here, as you know, as a therapist, there's a lot of anxiety sometimes and angst around it. And I think a lot of people, again, hear that very loaded term that breastfeeding is best. And they want to, and the desire is there to breastfeed. In fact, we know in the state of Colorado, initiation rates for breastfeeding are somewhere in the 90th percent. But then it quickly falls off after that. And it's really because of lack of support. And that support can really begin in the prenatal period. And I love to teach these breastfeeding basics class. I love to engage with families one-on-one in prenatal support. So I kind of equate it to just as you're thinking about how you're going to birth this baby and what hospital or birth center, or if you're going to have a home birth, it's really nice to know in a prenatal period, what are your feeding goals? What do you know about lactation? What have you seen in society? Because we really don't see a lot of it in society. A lot of this, unfortunately, is done behind closed doors and it's just not supported. And so having that prenatal education is really just like 90 minutes or 2 hours that you can devote. And it really sets you up to know what are the basics? What should I know? What are the signs that things are going right? And what are the signs that things might be more challenging? And one of the things that I love to do in these prenatal consultations is I love myth busting because there's just so much misinformation out there on the internet. I mean, a lot of good resources, but you can find kind of anything. And a lot of people want to tell you their own story and their own hardship and challenges. And that's fair. There are definitely challenges that come up. But I think sometimes the well meaning parent or friend who had a really rough experience, or even physician, right? Like if they've had a rough experience, they're not necessarily going to reflect breastfeeding in the most positive light. And so just knowing what is the scientific evidence, what tends to work, what are the things I need to look out for. That way, when you have this newborn and you're figuring out how to keep this child alive in all of the ways, including feeding them, you're set up for success. And also you're connected with support. So you know somebody, you're not Googling at 3 a.m. You know that you found somebody you trust. So when those issues pop up, we can address them, nip them in the bud. And instead of snowballing, like in my situation where you're in the ER at 5 days old, you can just have that person there on hand and know this is within the norm, or no, like I really need some extra help here.
And you spoke of myth busting. What are the top 3 myths that
Oh,
you try to bust?
yeah, that's a great question. I just had this one come up recently, and it was both from a mother-in-law and the person's mother. And it was that you have to prepare your nipples for breastfeeding. That number one, breastfeeding is going to hurt. That is a myth. It should not hurt. There might be a little bit of pain and sensation, but it is not supposed to just hurt on a scale like 0 to 10. We're looking for 2 or below and to quickly get to that 0 level, but it's going to hurt and you need to toughen up your nipples. And so you actually need to like abrade your nipples and put harsh stuff on them and get them ready so that when this baby comes on, they're ready and they're toughened up. Please don't do that. All you're going to do is
Wow.
set yourself up for infection and unnecessary pain. I think a lot of the myths are around milk supply and a lot of the anxiety, which is understandable. But I think we set ourselves up to just think that it's more likely than not to not be able to produce a full supply of milk for a baby, if that's your intention. And we know there are certain physiological reasons why a person might not come to a full supply, but they're minimal, right? It's not the majority. And I think that gets blown way out of proportion. And so then you see people on the other end of that, then they're adding and pumping and they're feeding the baby and they're pumping 8 times a day. And all of a sudden they've got this huge oversupply of milk and all of the issues associated with that. One of them being you might have to go out and buy a new deep freezer because you've just run out of room. This kid can't take all the milk you pump. And having more milk than less milk sounds like a good problem to have, but it really isn't. And then that kind of dovetail with a third is just that you should be prepared to formula feed and that you're going to need to do some sort of combination feeding. And I think that sometimes becomes very true for the ways that we don't support lactation and breastfeeding in our society. And sometimes it's very true because that's somebody's personal preference. And if that's the case, there's no issue there. But if somebody's intention is to fully supply milk further infant into toddlerhood or wherever they want to end up, there really isn't most of the time the need to do a combination. And sometimes people think, well, formula will offer some benefits and breast milk offers some benefits. And so if I combine the two, I'll have the best of both worlds. But we really know that the evidence shows that in a dose dependent world, the more breast milk an infant can get in those first months of life are really important and beneficial.
Well, thank you for busting those myths. That's important.
Sure.
I know you work with all different kinds of clients in your practice, and I saw on your website that you also work with adoptive parents. And in that process, how do you help those individuals if they're trying to feed their new adopted baby?
So I love working with families that know that they're going to bring an infant into their home, that they more often than not have some preparation in knowing, maybe not an exact timeline when that will happen, but also thinking about, okay, we might want to provide some human milk to this baby. And that can look really different. I don't think I've worked with a family where it's been the same story. I've worked with same sex partners where they both wanted to be able to provide milk for their baby and can help induce lactation. So there are different protocols that we can follow, and you don't actually have to be biologically pregnant with a child to be able to lactate and produce milk in most cases. So that can look like either building up a partial or full milk supply to feed that child. It can look like that family is not interested in actually feeding directly at the breast or chest, but they do understand the importance of providing human milk. And so that can look like safely counseling them in how to source human milk from other safe, reliable sources. There's a whole world of informal milk sharing. I think a lot of times that gets a bad rap of like it's just inherently unsafe. And that's not necessarily true. There are a lot of ways to screen donors and to make sure that the milk that you're getting is safe, or to get it from a friend or family member that is really trusted. So it's helping them know where to safely source that human milk and how to appropriately feed those amounts. And then sometimes it looks like a family that's not interested in providing human milk at all, and that wants to really know still, though, how to responsibly feed that infant with formula. And it's talking about appropriate feeding amounts in the bottle, safe formula preparation, developmentally meeting child's needs like throughout the early months, and being able to do things like not propping the bottle and making contact with the baby and approximating what they might do at breast or chest in terms of switching sides. And so switching sides with the bottle each and every time, or at least sometimes when you're feeding, so that that baby can kind of develop those same ways that they might if they were feeding at a parent's breast.
And along those same lines, obviously, nursing tends to be more than just feeding, right? There's the
Yes.
whole connection piece that you're talking about, the bonding, the attachment that's happening. And I'm curious, in your experience, how important is the skin to skin contact for those babies
Mm.
and little ones versus nursing or feeding a child over clothes?
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking to that, because it's a point I think that's overlooked a lot is like, okay, breastfeeding is just about good nutrition. And it's so much more than that. Like you just said, it's all about the attachment and feeling close and taken care of and responded to. And so there's some real ways to be able to do that when you're bottle feeding. And skin to skin is definitely one of those things. I mean, lots of research and evidence to show that it just regulates a baby. A baby really doesn't see themselves as a distinct being outside of those primary caregivers for several months of their lives. And so being right here, skin to skin, listening to a heartbeat, being able to just regulate body temperature, feeling that closeness, being able to drift off to sleep, knowing that they're cared for and safe. And sometimes I like to think of this as we've advanced a lot in terms of technology and the way that our society functions. But in terms of an anthropological lens, we really have not advanced that much in the 10,000 plus years of the human race. And so A baby, like they're wired to survive, and this here, skin to skin, no matter how they're fed, like that's their survival point. And they don't know if they're outside of the cave and the wolf might get them. They don't feel safe. And so they're in their right here, skin to skin. This is their place of comfort and where they're going to do best and where they're going to learn that really positive attachment. So no matter what kind of nutrition they're getting right here, it's just so important that they have that from trusted care providers.
So, in our society, we don't have great support, as you mentioned, for new parents. And a lot of people have to go back to work pretty quickly. In your experience, what are the challenges that tend to come up with people returning to work? And in addition to that, just people being outside of the home, what are the challenges that nursing parents tend to face when they are out in society in general in this country? And how do we make it easier?
Yeah. Sometimes I just want to see change. And I realize that change happens slowly. And we are starting to get back to normalizing what it looks to feed a baby and into toddlerhood, because we know that breast milk doesn't just lose its value at a year. It's a really good, important source of nutrition. Part of it is we're just not informed as a culture. Like we sexualize breasts. There are a lot more times you'll see in the Victoria's Secret ad or whatever, that's what we think breasts are for, rather than their true purpose is to feed the next generation. And it's true that returning to work or anything outside of the home is one of those challenges. It's one of those real big fall off points. So I mentioned earlier that 90% of people in Colorado have the intention to breastfeed. But by about that 3-month mark, the rates of exclusive breastfeeding fall off to about 50%. And then by 6 months, all the way to 25%. And even though the American Academy of Pediatrics has said now, people think of it as grandiose of like infants should receive human milk until 2 years of life. And I think even when I say that out loud to just general people in society, they're like, what? No, how does that possibly happen? And it's hard. It's hard when a parent is with a newborn. It's normal for them to wake several times in the night for several months of their life, if not more. But then that parent has to return to work outside of the home and function. And I certainly went through that trying to hold down a legal career of just being like, I don't know if I can do this. And I had workplace support, but then you have to drive your milk supply with a breast pump. And then that can be hard. And then if you're scheduled a meeting after meeting and you just don't have the ability to get that time away, even though it's legally required, we know it doesn't always happen, then you can just see milk supply start to downregulate. And it's hard to just drive a milk supply primarily by a breast pump. Not impossible, but it's not as easy as having a baby that's feeding at breast or chest. We saw during the pandemic, actually, breastfeeding rates extended because people weren't having to go to work outside of the home. The support, unfortunately, fell away because we all had to scramble, and we got pretty good pretty quickly at providing support by telehealth, but it wasn't the same as being in person. And for a while, when everybody was locked down, we just didn't have that support in place. But then when parents didn't have to leave the house to go outside to the workplace, they actually were able to extend that breastfeeding. So I feel like that's some real evidence that it's difficult. And then just in general, I think feeding in public, people just don't feel comfortable doing it. And there can be a lot of judgment, and there can be people that stare or say something preposterous, or they just don't feel comfortable doing it because of the way that we just don't normalize it. And so I think then it becomes a thing that has to be done in secret in the house, and it can just impact the way that infant feeding goes in general.
Along those same lines, do you think that there's an impact on the infant or child who's wanting to nurse and the parent doesn't feel comfortable in public? I think about the psychological impact that that could have on someone who obviously doesn't understand that it's a different environment than being at home. And maybe the parent doesn't feel comfortable, or maybe they're in a situation where others around them they can tell are not comfortable.
Right. I mean, I think it can create that real disconnect of why is my parent acting anxious, or why am I being told, no, I can't do this when this is something that I'm just used to. And along those lines, that's something we hear, unfortunately, oh, when a child's old enough to ask to be fed, then they're too old to be fed. I think it can be really confusing. And like you said, if they're not able to differentiate where is okay and where isn't okay.
I had an experience on a plane with my first, and she was probably a year and a half. And I was traveling by myself with her, and someone complained
Yeah,
to the flight
gosh.
attendant that I was nursing. And I was not
Oh,
exposing myself or anything, but my
right.
child wanted to eat and wanted some comfort. And I
Right.
was so disturbed by
Oh,
that
yeah.
experience of like, what are we doing? This is kind of crazy. And so I'm so interested also in your experience as a lawyer, working with healthcare, working specifically around supporting expectant and new parents and normalizing
Hmm.
lactation and normalizing the support for parents who are caring for their children and feeding them.
Yeah, I'm so sorry you had that experience. And unfortunately, like you'd think those are the one off, like that doesn't usually happen. But the more and more that I've worked in the field, the more and more you hear those stories and you can hear them in the media too, right? But yeah, it comes from just a genuine lack of understanding of where the norm could be in terms of nourishing, and especially a child who's on a plane. Again, a 1.5-year-old doesn't understand that they're on this tube and their ears are probably pressurized and they just wanted the comfort. From a legal perspective, breastfeeding and lactation is very legally protected. We have recently made some great strides in actually getting the enforcement there. In the state of Colorado since 2008. We've had workplace accommodations in place. In 2010, it happened federally, but there really wasn't like a lot of teeth to those laws. And then in all states, finally, I feel like maybe it was 2 to 3 years ago, there were still some states where you didn't have a right to nurse in public, but in every state, you have a protected right now to be able to nurse anywhere you have a legal right to be. So as long as you're not trespassing, that person has no reason to complain that you're breastfeeding in public, wherever that might be, a library, museum, plane. And part of it is educating the employees so that if somebody complains to the flight attendant to just say, look, she has a legal right to do that. So I'm not going to do anything more. I think maybe recently with the newer enacted laws that have actually provided some enforcement, because I think that's where it really speaks to companies of, oh, if we're not going to provide reasonable break time and a clean place that's outside of a bathroom to pump, we can actually be sued now. And so unfortunately, the money piece of it and the legal piece of it and the repercussions speak louder than just like it's a good thing to do. But a lot of it is educating the general public that they do have that right because not everybody is aware of it. And then let's be frank, even if they're aware of it, there's a power dynamic there between an employer and you need this job and you don't want to ruffle things. But the cases that are out there are really egregious in terms of fellow employees harassing somebody that needed to express their breast milk, or employers wrongfully firing or cutting back severely on somebody's hours because they were trying to provide human milk for their child. So really just as of 2022, we've gotten some of that actual teeth to the law. And I think we're going to start to see more and more litigation come out of that and hopefully just more good actors and more compliance in general.
And how different are the laws in, say, Colorado than the laws nationally and
Hmm.
perhaps internationally, if you know about maybe some European countries? Is it very different state by state, or are there more federal laws that are covering support of lactating individuals and feeding your children?
Yeah, great question. So, on a state basis, Colorado is one of the ones up there with like California in terms of protecting rights, and it's great. There's definitely a lot of variety. It's why we need the federal laws. For a long time, the federal laws had a big gap because they only covered people that weren't exempt. Basically, if you didn't qualify for overtime, you weren't part of the class of protected people. Colorado is extra tuned into the fact that lactation can go beyond a year of a child's life. And so they guarantee that right for the first 2 years of a child's life. They even say, like, you can get out of jury duty if you're providing human milk and you don't want to go and be sequestered away for however long that might be, you can just get a simple note from a provider, a lactation consultant to say, hey, this person can be excused. But all state laws are not at the same level, but the federal laws are now there. So the Pump Act was passed at the very end of 2022. It takes 9 million people that weren't protected under the original federal law and it brings them under that law. It guarantees reasonable time, doesn't have to be paid time, unfortunately, but reasonable time away from work to express breast milk or feed a child. And then it guarantees that clean, safe, private space. In terms of international laws, I don't know specifically. What I will say is the US is just really behind in terms of offering paid family leave. And so my sense is that a lot of it doesn't even necessarily come up because people are being able to stay within the home and provide for their family financially and aren't having to go back to work at sometimes as early as 10 days postpartum, as we are here, because then the choice is, do I feed my child or do I pay the rent? So I think in terms of the international environment, at least what I understand in Europe, people get a lot more paid time off to be home with their family.
And you said something interesting a little while back about the federal laws guarantee up until age 2. Is that correct?
The
Or
state,
Colorado. Colorado's
Colorado
law.
is up until age 2. Yes.
So if someone were to be out in public nursing their 3-year-old, would that cause
and sorry.
problems?
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. That's in terms of the employer's obligation to accommodate those people at work. The breastfeeding in public, it doesn't matter how old your child is. There's no age limit on that. It's just if you're still breastfeeding and you want to do that in public, no age limit, thankfully.
Yeah, that's great. So fascinating. Is there anything else that you feel like it's important to share for expectant and new parents about their nursing journey and the support that they can look for?
I think one of the main messages that I like to convey is that this whole parenting journey, whether it's feeding your child or whatever other step of parenting, it's not meant to be done alone in your living room. And I know that the nature of people being more mobile and relocating away from biological family, sometimes it can feel that way, but there are networks of support out there. And especially in this age of being able to connect online, that even if you can't find that infant feeding support or other pregnancy, postpartum support in your community, although I encourage you to look in the community because there are a lot of good resources out there. Oftentimes you can find them online. And I think that can just make such a difference. No matter your situation can be exactly the same. But if you're trying to figure it out either alone or maybe just with a partner, it can feel pretty lonely. And it really does take a village. And to not be afraid to go out and seek that village and to be vulnerable and to talk about how this is hard and I'm having a hard time or these are my successes and to be able to share those things, I think it can make a huge difference in feeding and just feeling successful and a little bit more mentally well in general.
Thank you so much. We've been speaking today with Heather Elkins. She's the owner of Root Love Lactation Services. It's been a real pleasure having you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Prepared for Parenthood podcast today. I hope you found this episode educational, informational, and conversational, and that you'll join me again for another episode soon. If you enjoyed listening to today's podcast, I'd very much appreciate if you would rate, review, and subscribe. If you're interested in more information related to today's podcast or are looking for parent coaching or courses, you can find my information in the show notes or online at preparedforparenthood.com.